In this video, we will cover one of the most haunting unsolved murder cases in American history, the 1991 yogurt shop murders in Austin, Texas. 4 teenage girls killed, the wrong man in prison, and the real killer walks free. On the night of December 6, 1991, 4 girls were inside an I Can't Believe It's yogurt shop on West Anderson Lane in Austin, Texas. 2 of them worked there. The other 2 had stopped by to get a ride home when the shop closed at 11. Just before midnight, an Austin patrol officer spotted fire coming from the building and called it in. When firefighters arrived and put out the blaze, they found all 4 girls inside. They were nude, bound with their own undergarments, shot in the head, and the building had been set on fire around them. The youngest was 13 years old. The city of Austin had never seen anything like it, and the community was shaken in a way that lasted for decades. The case immediately became one of the largest criminal investigations in Texas history. Austin police received thousands of tips. More than 50 people confessed to the murders. None of those confessions led anywhere. Years passed without an arrest. Then, in 1999, police arrested 4 young men and obtained confessions from 2 of them. Those 2 men were tried, convicted, and imprisoned. One of them sentenced to death. But there was no physical evidence connecting either man to the crime. Their convictions were later overturned, and by 2009 the charges against both had been dropped entirely. They had spent nearly a decade in prison for murders they did not commit. What investigators eventually discovered was that the real killer had been stopped at a U.S. Border Patrol checkpoint in New Mexico less than 48 hours after the murders, driving a stolen vehicle and carrying one of the weapons used in the killings. He was charged with unrelated offenses and released. He died in January 1999 before anyone connected him to Austin. The break in the case finally came from a 13-year-old girl who fought back the night she was killed. The DNA she left under her fingernails sat in evidence for 34 years before technology could match it to the man responsible. Hit subscribe so you never miss any of our videos, and let's get into it. Jennifer Harbison was 17 years old, a senior in high school, and had a job at the I Can't Believe It's yogurt shop on West Anderson Lane in Austin. She was described by people who knew her as hardworking and dependable, the kind of teenager who showed up for her shifts and took the work seriously. That Friday night, December 6, 1991, Jennifer was working the closing shift alongside her coworker and friend Eliza Thomas. Eliza Thomas was also 17. She was social and energetic, known by friends and family for her interest in fitness and fashion. Her younger sister, Sonora, was 13 years old at the time and looked up to Eliza the way younger sisters do. Sonora later described her as someone who was in the middle of figuring out who she was, discovering her identity, finding her place in the world. Eliza had been working at the yogurt shop and had her own life building around her. She and Jennifer worked that evening together, closing down the shop as they had done before. Sarah Harbison was Jennifer's younger sister. She was 15 years old, a freshman in high school, and was active in sports and clubs. That night, Sarah had come to the shop to wait for Jennifer's shift to end so she could get a ride home. She was not working. She was simply there with her older sister, the way younger siblings often are, waiting, trusting, present. Jennifer and Sarah were the only 2 children of their mother, Barbara Ayers Wilson. Both of them were in that shop when it closed. Amy Ayers was 13 years old. She was the youngest of the 4 girls, and by her family's account she was what her brother Sean later called just a cowgirl. She loved animals, horses and cats in particular. She had been raised around animals and was the kind of kid who genuinely cared about the creatures and people around her. Her brother described her as an old soul at an early age. Amy was involved in the Future Farmers of America program at her school, and that was how she had become friends with the older girls. Jennifer and Sarah and Eliza were all connected to FFA as well, and that shared interest in animals and agricultural programs had brought them together. Amy was not an employee of the shop. She was there that night for the same reason Sarah was, to get a ride home with her friends when Jennifer's shift ended at 11 p.m. for girls, ages 13, 15, 17, and 17. 2 of them were working. 2 of them were waiting. All 4 of them knew each other through school and through their shared involvement in Future Farmers of America, an organization built around agricultural education and the kind of hands-on, community-minded work that all 4 of them had been drawn to. That connection, animals, programs, friendship, the ordinary rhythms of high school life, was what had put them all in the same building on the same night. Jennifer and Sarah Harbison were sisters. Eliza Thomas had a younger sister at home who idolized her. Amy Ayers had a brother who remembered her with quiet, specific grief 30 years later. The horses, the cats, the fact that she cared about people. These were not abstractions. They were teenagers with specific personalities and relationships and futures that had not yet happened. Jennifer was nearly done with high school. Sarah was just beginning it. Eliza was still working out who she wanted to be. Amy was 13 years old, which is almost too young to fully process, and she had only come that night because her friends were there. Their mother, Barbara Ayers Wilson, told a reporter in 1992 that her life had been focused around her daughters from here to eternity, and that someone had taken eternity away from her. Just before midnight on Friday, December 6, 1991, an Austin police officer driving past a strip mall on West Anderson Lane noticed fire coming from inside the I Can't Believe It's yogurt shop. He called it in immediately. The Austin Fire Department arrived and began working to extinguish the blaze. When the flames were finally out, firefighters moved inside. What they found would shock every first responder on the scene. Jennifer Harbison and Eliza Thomas had been working the closing shift that evening. The shop was scheduled to close at 11 p.m. Sarah Harbison and Amy Ayers had come in earlier that night, not to work, but to wait for Jennifer so she could drive them home. By the time the officer spotted the fire, it was nearly midnight. The shop had been closed for close to an hour. Inside, firefighters discovered the bodies of all 4 girls. Jennifer was 17, Sarah was 15, Eliza was 17, Amy was 13. All 4 had been stripped of their clothing. All 4 had been bound and gagged using their own undergarments. All 4 had been shot in the head with a .22 caliber weapon. Jennifer, Sarah, and Eliza had been severely charred by the fire. Their bodies showed the full extent of what the flames had done in the time before firefighters arrived. Amy Ayers was found in a separate area of the shop. Her body had not been burned as badly as the others, but the injuries she sustained told a different story entirely. She had been shot twice. The first bullet struck her head but missed her brain. It was not enough to kill her. A second shot caused catastrophic brain damage, exiting through her lateral cheek and jawline. She had also been strangled with a sock-like cloth around her neck. She had been struck with a cash register. Second-degree burns and early third-degree burns covered between 25% and 30% of her body. Amy's family would later say that she fought for her life. The evidence at the scene confirmed it. The injuries to all 4 girls pointed to a crime that was methodical and deliberate. They had been controlled, restrained, and killed with a weapon brought to the scene. The fire had been set after the fact. It was not an accident, and it was not incidental. Whoever did this had tried to burn the building down around the bodies of 4 teenagers. For first responders, the scene was unlike anything Austin police had encountered before. Smoke and soot covered every surface inside the shop. Investigator John Jones, who worked the case, later said that the smoke and soot made fingerprinting extremely difficult. Nearly every surface that might have held a usable print had been compromised. The water from the firefighting effort had spread through the entire interior, mixing with debris, accelerant, and whatever physical evidence had survived the fire itself. The sprinkler system had activated as the flames spread through the building. That water, combined with the thousands of gallons used by the fire department, had done additional damage to what little evidence the fire had left behind. Trace evidence that might have survived the heat was now soaked, displaced, or destroyed entirely. The crime scene that investigators needed to process had been altered by the very efforts required to reach the victims. The investigation would ultimately rely on interviews, witness statements, and the limited physical evidence that could be recovered. Detectives worked methodically to establish timelines and identify anyone who had been near the location during the critical hours before the fire. They sought to understand the sequence of events. When had the girls first arrived at the shop? When had someone gained entry? And when exactly had the fire been set? Every detail mattered, no matter how insignificant it might seem. The shop's proximity to West Anderson Lane, a busy commercial street, meant that potential witnesses likely existed somewhere in the surrounding area. Finding those witnesses and convincing them to come forward became a priority for investigators. What had unfolded inside the yogurt shop would demand unprecedented effort from Austin's law enforcement. Austin police set up a task force almost immediately. The scale of what had happened demanded it. 4 girls were dead. They had been murdered inside a business on a busy commercial street in the middle of a major American city. There was no question that this was a targeted, violent crime. The only questions were who had done it, how they had gotten in, and whether anyone had seen anything at all. Investigators began canvassing the area around West Anderson Lane. They talked to nearby businesses and residents. They looked for anyone who had been in or around the strip mall that night. The shop's location, visible from the street and surrounded by other commercial tenants, should have made it difficult for someone to commit 4 murders without being seen. But the timing, late on a Friday night, after the surrounding businesses had closed, had worked in the killer's favor. The fire had done exactly what it was intended to do. It had consumed the interior of the shop, destroyed physical evidence, and made the work of forensic investigators exponentially harder. The 4 victims had been left with almost nothing to offer investigators in the way of trace evidence. The crime scene, by the time it could be fully examined, had been fundamentally altered. The fire and the water from the firefighting efforts had already destroyed or contaminated most of the evidence inside. In the days after the murders, the Austin Police Department was flooded with tips, thousands of them, and within weeks, more than 50 different people had confessed to killing the 4 girls. None of those confessions held up. Investigators worked through each one, and every single lead collapsed under scrutiny. The sheer volume of false confessions was staggering, and it consumed enormous investigative resources in the months that followed. Among those who claimed responsibility was Kenneth McDuff, a convicted killer who confessed to the yogurt shop murders on the day of his own execution for an entirely separate crime. His confession, like all the others, went nowhere. The fire had already done severe damage to the crime scene, and the water from firefighting efforts had compounded that destruction. Fingerprinting was nearly impossible. Trace evidence had been contaminated or lost entirely. Investigators were working with almost nothing physical to go on, which made each credible-sounding tip feel more significant than it might otherwise have been. The Austin Police Department formed a dedicated task force and continued to field calls from the public, but the case refused to break open. Within a week of the murders, a development emerged that briefly seemed like progress. A 16-year-old named Morris Pierce was arrested at North Cross Mall, a shopping center located near the yogurt shop, after he was found carrying a gun that was the same make and model as the weapon used in the killings. Police brought him in for questioning. Pierce gave investigators information that initially seemed promising. He named 3 friends, all of them teenagers, none older than 17 at the time of the murders. For a short period, detectives treated these 4 young men as serious suspects. But after extended questioning, investigators concluded that Pierce was simply trying to get himself out of the firearms charge. His account of events didn't hold together under scrutiny, and there was no physical evidence connecting him or the 3 friends he had named to the yogurt shop that night. All 4 were eliminated as suspects. It was a dead end. The case settled into an agonizing stillness after that. Tips continued to come in, but none produced anything actionable. The task force kept working, but the trail grew colder with each passing month. Austin was a city that had not experienced anything close to this kind of violence before. 4 girls murdered in a place as ordinary as an ice cream shop on a Friday night in a busy commercial neighborhood. The randomness of it made it worse. There was no clear motive that the public could point to, no robbery that went wrong in any way investigators could confirm, no suspect who fit the pattern. People stopped feeling safe in the places they had taken for granted. The families of the 4 girls were living through something that had no precedent and no resolution. Barbara Ayers Wilson, who had lost both her daughters, was left with questions that the investigation could not answer. The Ayers family, the Thomas family, all of them waited for news that did not come. Sonora Thomas, who had been 13 years old when her sister Eliza was killed, was left without the siblings she had looked up to and no explanation of what had happened or who was responsible. The community organized vigils and memorials and demanded accountability, but demanding accountability requires knowing who is accountable. Local journalists covered the case extensively. Investigators made public appeals for information. The tip line stayed open. And still nothing broke. The physical evidence that had survived the fire was not sufficient to generate a suspect, and every person who had walked through the door, claiming to be responsible, had turned out to be lying or delusional or both. Serial killer McDuff had offered his confession as a final act before his own execution, and even that came to nothing. Austin had changed in a specific and permanent way after December 6, 1991. The city's sense of itself as a relatively safe, mid-sized college town was altered by what happened inside that shop. Parents kept closer watch on their children. People were more careful about where they went at night. The particular horror of what had been done to those 4 girls, their ages, the place they died, the fact that Amy Ayers had simply been waiting for a ride home, made the case impossible to put aside for the people who lived there. The Austin Police Department never officially closed the investigation. Officers rotated through the case over the years, and the evidence that survived was preserved. But for a long time, preservation was all investigators could offer. Years passed, the case went cold, and the families of Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, and Jennifer and Sarah Harbison waited. In 1999, nearly 8 years after the murders, Austin police made arrests. The detective who had taken over the case had gone back to look at 4 young men who had been briefly considered and then dismissed in the weeks after the 1991 murders. At that time, they had been teenagers. Morris Pierce, Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, and Forrest Wellborn, none of them older than 17. By 1999, they were in their mid-20s, and investigators believed a fresh round of interrogations was worth pursuing. What followed was a series of intense questioning sessions that would eventually produce confessions from 2 of the 4 men. Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott both gave statements in which they described all 4 men entering the yogurt shop on the night of December 6, 1991, and participating in the murders of the 4 girls. The confessions were detailed. Investigators considered them a breakthrough. For a case that had produced nothing but dead ends for nearly a decade, these confessions felt like the resolution the Austin community had been waiting for. The interrogations were conducted over multiple days, with each suspect facing relentless questioning in isolation. Detectives presented the young men with details of the crime scene and suggested scenarios of what might have transpired. In several instances, investigators claimed to have evidence they did not actually possess, a common interrogation tactic that is legal in many jurisdictions but can easily mislead vulnerable suspects into false confessions. The sessions stretched for hours, with minimal breaks and no access to counsel during initial questioning. As fatigue set in and the psychological pressure mounted, both Springsteen and Scott eventually provided the detailed confessions that detectives had been seeking. The statements implicated all four young men in the murders, giving investigators the breakthrough they had desperately needed after years of investigative dead ends. Both Springsteen and Scott would later say their confessions were coerced. They each claimed that the interrogations had gone on for extended periods, that detectives had applied pressure, and that they had ultimately told investigators what was needed to make the questioning stop. Neither man maintained that his confession was a voluntary, truthful account of what had happened inside that yogurt shop, but at the time, those objections were not enough to prevent charges from being filed. Morris Pierce and Forrest Wellborn were also arrested. However, investigators were unable to build a case against either man that prosecutors felt confident bringing to trial. The charges against Pierce and Wellborn were eventually dropped for lack of evidence. Springsteen and Scott were the only two who went to trial. There was no physical evidence placing either Robert Springsteen or Michael Scott at the yogurt shop on December 6, 1991. No fingerprints, no DNA match, no witness who placed them at the scene. The prosecution's entire case against both men rested on the confessions alone. Joe James Sawyer, the attorney representing Springsteen, was direct about what he believed that meant. He said that the only thing that had ever tied his client or Michael Scott to that crime scene was their confessions. Confessions both men said had been taken under coercion. The trials were conducted separately. Springsteen's came first, followed by Scott's. The decision to try them separately created a fundamental problem that would haunt the proceedings for years afterward. Because the trials were separate, prosecutors used each man's confession against the other. In Springsteen's trial, portions of Scott's confession were introduced as evidence. In Scott's trial, Springsteen's confession was used against him. Neither man was present at the other's trial to testify, which meant that neither defendant had the opportunity to cross-examine the person whose words were being used to convict him. Sawyer called the process massively unfair to his client. He argued that it had been done systematically and with deliberation, and that the structure of the two trials had been designed in a way that made it nearly impossible to mount a meaningful defense. The confessions were being used as weapons against men who could not directly challenge the person who had given them. The juries in both cases convicted. The weight of those confessions, even without corroborating physical evidence, was enough. Jurors heard detailed accounts of what allegedly happened inside the yogurt shop that night, and they found them credible enough to return guilty verdicts. The sentencing reflected the severity of what the girls had suffered. Springsteen was sentenced to death. Scott received life in prison. For the Austin community, for the police department, and for the prosecutors who had spent years trying to bring the case to trial, the convictions felt like a form of justice. The four girls finally had justice, or so it appeared. The families of Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison had been given a verdict after nearly 10 years of waiting. There were names attached to the crimes now. There were men sitting in prison. The long nightmare, it seemed, was finally over. But Springsteen and Scott maintained from their cells that they had not been inside that yogurt shop. They maintained that their confessions had been extracted under pressure, and did not reflect the truth of what had happened on December 6, 1991. And the question of what physical evidence existed to independently confirm their guilt remained unanswered, because the answer was that none existed. The case had been built entirely on words that two men said they had been pressured into speaking, words that had been read aloud in separate courtrooms to separate juries who had no way of measuring their reliability against anything but each other. The fire that destroyed the crime scene nearly 8 years earlier had made certain that no fingerprint, no fiber, no biological trace would ever emerge to either confirm or contradict what those confessions claimed. Springsteen received the death penalty, and Scott was sentenced to life in prison, and the families of the 4 girls were told the case was finally closed. 5 years after their convictions, the cases against Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott began to fall apart. The legal mechanism that unraveled everything was rooted in a fundamental constitutional guarantee. In separate trials, prosecutors had used each man's confession against the other. Because the trials were held separately, neither Springsteen nor Scott had the opportunity to cross-examine the other. A federal judge ruled that this arrangement violated their Sixth Amendment right to confront witnesses against them. The confessions, the only evidence tying either man to the crime scene, could not legally be used the way they had been. The convictions were overturned. At that point, the Travis County District Attorney's Office faced a decision. They could retry both men, start the process again, and attempt to build a case without relying on the constitutionally problematic use of the confessions against each other. Rosemary Lamberg, the district attorney at the time, intended to do exactly that. But before proceeding to a second round of trials, her office decided to take advantage of a DNA testing method that had only recently become available to investigators. It was called YSTR testing, and it was specifically designed to isolate and extract male DNA from a sample. The technique was more targeted and more sensitive than anything that had been used on the evidence from the 1991 murders. Lamberg's office ordered YSTR testing on vaginal swabs taken from the victims the night of the killings. Those swabs had been collected at the crime scene and held in evidence storage for more than a decade. The results came back, and they changed everything. A partial male DNA profile was recovered from one of the victims. That alone was significant. It was the clearest biological evidence the investigation had ever produced. But the profile did not match Robert Springsteen. It did not match Michael Scott. It did not match Maurice Pierce or Forrest Wellborn. It did not match any of the 4 men who had been arrested, tried, or charged in connection with the murders. The DNA belonged to someone else entirely. Someone who had never been identified. Someone who had apparently never been on the investigation's radar. For the district attorney's office, this was not simply an inconvenience. It was the clearest possible indication that the men in custody had not committed the crime. The physical evidence, the only biological trace left behind by whoever had been in that yogurt shop that night, pointed to a person who was not Robert Springsteen and was not Michael Scott. The entire foundation of the prosecutions had been the confessions. There was no fingerprint evidence, no eyewitness, no weapon, no forensic link of any kind placing either man at the scene. And now there was DNA evidence pointing directly away from them. In 2009, the charges against both men were dropped. After spending nearly 10 years in prison, Springsteen under a death sentence, Scott under a life sentence, they were released, but they were not exonerated. The district attorney's office did not declare them innocent. The charges were dropped without prejudice, which meant they could theoretically be recharged at a later date if new evidence emerged. That legal distinction mattered. It meant Springsteen and Scott walked out of custody carrying the weight of the original accusations without any formal acknowledgement that those accusations had been wrong. They had no convictions, but they had no clearance either. They existed in a kind of legal suspension, released but not vindicated. For the families of Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison, the situation was almost impossible to process. In 2001, they had been told the case was closed. 2 men had been convicted. There was supposed to be an answer. And then, piece by piece, that answer was dismantled. The convictions came apart on constitutional grounds. The DNA pointed somewhere no one could follow. And in 2009, the men who had been imprisoned for killing their daughters and sisters were simply let go, with no replacement suspect, no new arrest, no explanation for who the DNA actually belonged to. The grief that the families had carried since December 1991 had never fully lifted. But the decade after the convictions had at least offered the illusion of resolution. The 2009 dismissals removed even that. Barbara Ayers Wilson had lost both of her daughters, Jennifer and Sarah, in a single night. Sonora Thomas had lost her only sibling. Sean Ayers had lost his younger sister. They had waded through years of investigation, through arrests, through 2 separate trials, through appeals, through reversals. And at the end of it, they were told that the men who had confessed to the crime were not, based on the physical evidence, the men who had done it. What remained was a partial DNA profile sitting in a laboratory, extracted from evidence collected the night of the murders. It belonged to a male whose identity was completely unknown. Investigators had no name to attach to it, no criminal record to search against it, no suspect to test it against. The profile existed. The person it belonged to did not yet exist within the scope of the investigation. He was out there somewhere, or he had been, and nobody knew where to look. The charges were dropped in 2009. Both men walked free after nearly a decade in prison, and the only thing investigators knew for certain was that they had a partial DNA profile belonging to the real killer, and no idea whose it was. Robert Eugene Brashers was born on March 13, 1958, and by the time he died in January 1999, he had left a trail of murders stretching across at least 4 states. Investigators would spend years piecing together who he was and what he had done. During his lifetime, he was never identified as a suspect in any of his murders. He moved through Kentucky, Missouri, South Carolina, and Texas, killing women and leaving almost no trace, at least none that anyone connected to him while he was still alive. The picture that eventually emerged was of a man who had been committing serious violent crimes long before 1991, and who had given law enforcement every reason to watch him closely. They didn't. In 1985, Brashers was convicted of attempted murder for shooting a woman. He served time in prison for that offense. In 1989, he was granted parole. That release came just 2 years before 4 teenage girls were murdered in a yogurt shop in Austin, Texas. He had already demonstrated that he was capable of shooting a woman and leaving her for dead. The parole board released him anyway, and within 2 years, he was killing again. His first confirmed murder came in 1990. Genevieve Zitricki was 28 years old and lived in Greenville, South Carolina. She was found beaten and strangled in her bathtub. Investigators at the time had no suspect and no meaningful leads. The case went cold. Zitricki's death would not be connected to Brashers until decades later, when DNA technology caught up to what he had done. By then, Brashers had been dead for years. The pattern of how he operated became clearer, as more of his crimes were identified. He worked alone. That detail is important because controlling multiple victims alone requires a particular kind of calculated violence. He would gain physical control of his victims quickly and through force. He used their own clothing to bind them, turning something ordinary into a restraint. He carried multiple weapons. He was willing to commit arson to destroy what he left behind. and he sexually assaulted his victims. Every one of those elements appeared across multiple crime scenes in multiple states, which is part of why it took so long to recognize that a single man was responsible for all of them. In December 1991, he was in Austin. He walked into that yogurt shop on West Anderson Lane after hours and did to those 4 girls what he had done before and would do again. He was alone. He controlled 4 teenage girls. He bound them with their own undergarments. He sexually assaulted at least one of them. He shot each of them. And then he set the building on fire. He was in New Mexico less than 48 hours later. By 1997, he was in Memphis, Tennessee. A 14-year-old girl was raped there that year. DNA evidence eventually connected that assault to Brashers as well. He was 39 years old at the time. He had been committing crimes of this type for at least 7 years by then, and he had never been charged with a single one of the murders. A year after Memphis, in 1998, Brashers killed again. This time in Missouri, near the small town of Portageville, roughly 250 kilometers southeast of St. Louis. The victims were Sherry Scherer and her daughter Megan. Sherry was an adult. Megan was 12 years old. Brashers sexually assaulted Megan before killing both of them. After his body was exhumed in 2018, Missouri authorities linked him to those murders through DNA evidence. He had been dead for nearly 2 decades before anyone knew he was responsible. Across all of his identified crimes, from the 1990 killing of Genevieve Zitricki in South Carolina to the 1998 murders in Missouri, investigators count at least 8 victims. The actual number may be higher. He operated for nearly a decade between his 1989 parole and his death in January 1999, moving across state lines and leaving behind crime scenes that were often contaminated or destroyed by fire or water. Connecting those scenes to a single man required DNA technology and forensic genealogy tools that simply did not exist during most of the years he was active. What made him particularly difficult to identify was his consistency in acting without accomplices. Every arrest he faced during his life, and there were a few, was for crimes that did not require investigators to build a network or identify co-conspirators. He was caught with a stolen vehicle. He was charged with a weapons offense. No one was looking for a serial killer because no one yet knew there was one. He existed, in the records, as a felon with a weapons charge and a parole violation, not as a man responsible for the deaths of at least 8 people across 4 states. That gap between what he was doing and what law enforcement understood him to be is part of what allowed him to keep killing for as long as he did. It's also part of why 4 men in Austin spent years in prison for crimes they did not commit. Investigators were looking for multiple perpetrators, partly because controlling 4 victims alone seemed implausible. But Brashers had done exactly that before. He had controlled 4 women alone in a 1997 incident in Memphis, binding them and sexually assaulting one of them. It was not outside his capabilities. It was exactly what he was capable of. In every case, the pattern was consistent. He worked alone. He controlled his victims with force. He tied them with their own clothing, and he left behind evidence of sexual assault. On December 8, 1991, less than 48 hours after 4 girls were murdered in a yogurt shop in Austin, a U.S. Border Patrol agent stopped a pickup truck at an interior checkpoint on Interstate 10 in New Mexico. The driver was Robert Eugene Brashers. He was 33 years old and heading westbound, away from Texas. The truck he was driving had been reported stolen out of Marietta, Georgia on November 29th, more than a week before the murders. Investigators would later piece together that Brashers had been moving through the South and Southwest in a stolen vehicle, following a pattern that fit everything else known about the way he operated. He rarely stayed in one place. He moved between states. He left bodies behind him and kept driving. When the Border Patrol agent ran the vehicle, the stolen report came back. Agents searched the truck. Inside, they found a .380 AMT backup pistol. Brashers had a prior felony conviction from 1985, which made him prohibited from possessing any firearm. When the weapon was discovered, Brashers fled. He drove approximately 1 mile before pulling over and surrendering to agents. He was taken into custody and charged with auto theft and felon in possession of a firearm. 400 miles to the east, in Austin, Texas, detectives were still working a crime scene where 4 teenage girls had been found shot, bound, and left in a burning building. The investigation was in its earliest hours. Thousands of tips had not yet come in. The full scale of what had happened on West Anderson Lane was still being processed by the city. Nobody in Austin knew that on December 8th, a man in federal custody in New Mexico had been stopped with a .380 pistol while driving a stolen vehicle out of Texas. The .380 AMT backup was the same make and model as one of the weapons used in the yogurt shop murders. At the time, that connection was not made. Brashers was processed on the auto theft charge and the weapons charge. The .380 pistol was logged into evidence. He eventually served time for those offenses and was released. What investigators would confirm decades later is something that is difficult to absorb. The serial number on the .380 pistol recovered at the New Mexico checkpoint was the same serial number on the gun Robert Eugene Brashers used to kill himself on January 19, 1999. He had held on to that weapon for the better part of 8 years. He had carried it across state lines, through a federal checkpoint, into custody, and somehow retained it or recovered it in the years that followed. That gun was with him at the end of his life. It was the same gun that agents had photographed and logged in December 1991, 2 days after 4 girls were killed in Austin. The question that has no satisfying answer is what would have happened if someone had made the connection in December 1991. Brashers was in federal custody. He was a convicted felon caught in a stolen vehicle with a firearm of the same make and model used in a quadruple homicide committed 48 hours earlier and 400 miles away. He was moving westbound, away from Austin. The circumstantial case was not nothing. Whether it would have been enough to hold him, to investigate him further, to eventually match him to the yogurt shop murders, that cannot be known. What is known is that it did not happen. Brashers served his sentence for the stolen vehicle and the weapons charge. He was released. He continued committing crimes. In 1997, he raped a 14-year-old girl in Memphis, Tennessee. In 1998, he murdered Sherry Scherer and her 12-year-old daughter Megan near Portageville, Missouri, sexually assaulting the child before killing both of them. He was not identified as a suspect in any of his murders during his lifetime. Not in South Carolina, not in Tennessee, not in Missouri, not in Texas. In January 1999, Brashers died by suicide. He had never been charged with a single homicide. The yogurt shop case had gone cold. Maurice Pierce, Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, and Forrest Wellborn had not yet been arrested. The families of Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison were still waiting for answers. And the man who had killed those 4 girls, who had been stopped at a federal checkpoint 2 days after the murders with a matching weapon in a stolen truck, had been dead for years before anyone began seriously looking at him. The Border Patrol stop in December 1991 is the detail that most clearly defines what went wrong in the early years of this investigation. Not because it was anyone's obvious failure. The connection required information that was not yet centralized, not yet linked, not yet searchable in the way it would eventually become. but the proximity is undeniable. 2 days, 400 miles, a stolen truck, a matching weapon, a convicted felon fleeing Texas. He was charged with auto theft and felon in possession of a firearm, and the connection to the murders in Austin was never made. Detective Dan Jackson was assigned to the yogurt shop murders decades after the crime, and he approached it differently. By the time Jackson took a serious look at the case, the original investigators had retired. The 4 men arrested in 1999 had been released, and the partial DNA profile recovered through YSTR testing had been sitting unmatched for years. There were no strong leads. There was no clear path forward. What Jackson had was a cold case file, a box of physical evidence collected in December 1991, and access to technology that had not existed when those girls were killed. One of his first moves was to submit a .380 caliber bullet casing that had been recovered from a drain inside the yogurt shop to the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network. That database, known as NIBIN, is used by law enforcement agencies across the country to link firearms to crimes by comparing the unique marks a weapon leaves on spent casings. The casing had been sitting in evidence storage for decades. Investigators in 1991 and 1999 had not had the tools or the database infrastructure to make use of it the way Jackson could. He also requested a more advanced and more sensitive DNA analysis than anything that had been run on the physical evidence before. The YSTR testing from years earlier had produced a partial profile. Jackson wanted to push further. The evidence he focused on came from Amy Ayers. She was 13 years old when she died. She was the youngest of the 4 girls, and she had not been at the yogurt shop to work that night. She was there to get a ride home with Jennifer and Sarah Harbison when the shop closed. According to her family, Amy did not go quietly. She had been struck with a cash register. She had been shot twice because the first bullet did not kill her. She had been strangled. Her family said she fought, and the evidence supported that completely. Beneath her fingernails, crime scene investigators had collected biological material the night of the murders. Samples from her body had been preserved and held in evidence storage. That material had never been fully exploited by the technology available at the time it was collected. The advanced DNA testing Jackson requested was run on those fingernail samples. What came back changed everything. The analysis produced a DNA profile, a male DNA profile, with a 2.5 million to 1 likelihood of belonging to a single individual, according to the findings reported by the South Carolina State Lab. That ratio is not an uncertainty, that is a virtual certainty. The DNA under Amy Ayers' fingernails, collected from her body on the night of December 6, 1991, contained the genetic material of the man who killed her. On August 22, 2025, Detective Jackson received the South Carolina lab report that linked the profile recovered from Amy's fingernails to a known DNA profile from a 1990 sexual assault and murder in Greenville, South Carolina. That earlier crime had involved the killing of 28-year-old Genevieve Zetricki, whose body was found beaten and strangled in her bathtub. The DNA profile from that 1990 case had already been attributed to Robert Eugene Brashers through investigative genetic genealogy work conducted by C.C. Moore in 2018. Brashers had already been linked to multiple murders across several states. His genetic profile was in the system. When the results from Amy's fingernail samples came back, they matched his profile directly. The implications of that match were significant in several directions at once. It confirmed what the YSTR testing years earlier had already suggested, that the 4 men arrested in 1999 had nothing to do with the murders. It placed Brashers at the scene, not through circumstantial evidence or proximity, but through his own biology. Amy had scratched him. She had reached out and taken something from the man who was killing her, and that something survived the fire, the water from the firefighting efforts, 34 years of storage, and every failed attempt to identify the killer through other means. Amy Ayers had been described by her family as an old soul, a cowgirl, someone who cared about animals and people alike. She was a 13-year-old who joined the Future Farmers of America and made friends with older girls through a shared love of animals. She had no reason to be in that yogurt shop after 11 p.m. on December 6th, except to catch a ride home. She was the youngest person killed that night, and she was the only one found in a separate part of the building from the others. Her family said she had to be subdued multiple times because she kept resisting. She was struck, strangled, and shot twice. She still scratched her attacker hard enough to collect his DNA beneath her nails. That act of resistance, the physical, biological trace of Amy Ayers refusing to go without a fight, is the reason the case was solved. Not a confession, not a witness, not a surveillance camera or a license plate. A 13-year-old girl scratched the man who was killing her, and that scratch preserved the evidence that would identify him more than 3 decades later. Jackson had spent years working through the details of a case that had destroyed careers, produced wrongful convictions, and outlasted most of the original investigators. The technology he used had not existed when Amy Ayers died. The databases had not been built yet. The sensitivity of the DNA analysis required had not been available. But the evidence itself had been there since 1991, waiting. It was collected from her body on the night of the murders by crime scene investigators who could not have known what they were actually preserving. Detective Jackson said it plainly. It was Amy's fighting back that solved this case. I'm sorry it took 30, 40 years for us to get here, but we're here now. On September 26, 2025, the Austin Police Department announced that they had identified the man who killed Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison 34 years earlier. The man's name was Robert Eugene Brashers. He had been dead for 26 years. The identification was made possible in part because Brashers had already been named in connection with other crimes years before the yogurt shop case was formally resolved. In 2018, genetic genealogist Cece Moore had used investigative genetic genealogy to link Brashers to murders in other states. That work placed his DNA profile into investigative databases, and when Detective Dan Jackson submitted the evidence from Amy Ayers' fingernails for advanced testing, there was already a reference point to match against. The South Carolina State Laboratory had previously linked Brashers to the 1990 murder of Genevieve Zatricki in Greenville, and that profile was the anchor. The DNA recovered from under Amy's nails matched it at a ratio of 2.5 million to 1. In the months before the September announcement, public attention had returned to the case in a significant way. A documentary miniseries titled The Yogurt Shop Murders, directed by Margaret Brown, had premiered at the South by Southwest Film Festival in Austin in March 2025. It aired on HBO beginning August 3, 2025, less than 2 months before Austin police made their announcement. The series included interviews with surviving family members, former investigators, attorneys who had represented Springsteen and Scott, and experts who had worked various aspects of the case over the decades. It brought the story to a national audience that, for many viewers, was encountering it for the first time. The timing meant that millions of people were already re-engaged with the case when the police announcement came in late September. The announcement confirmed what the DNA evidence had established. Brashers had acted alone. He had entered the yogurt shop on the night of December 6, 1991, controlled 4 teenage girls by himself, bound them, sexually assaulted at least one of them, shot each of them, and set the building on fire before leaving. His pattern across other crimes showed he was capable of exactly that. He had controlled 4 women alone in Memphis in 1997. He had used fire to destroy evidence before. He had always worked without an accomplice. Every element matched. Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn had nothing to do with it. Springsteen and Scott had spent nearly a decade in prison. Springsteen had been sentenced to death. His sentence was later reduced to life without parole before the conviction was overturned, but he had lived under a death sentence for years for a crime he had not committed. Scott had been sentenced to life in prison. Both men had given confessions that they later said were coerced during extended interrogations, and the DNA evidence confirmed there was never any physical connection between either of them and the crime scene. Pierce and Wellborn had charges dropped before trial. None of the four men had killed those girls. The confessions were false. The convictions were wrong. Brashers cannot be prosecuted. He died on January 19, 1999. He was 40 years old. He killed himself, and the weapon he used was the same .380 AMT backup pistol that a U.S. Border Patrol agent had found in a stolen truck on Interstate 10 in New Mexico on December 8, 1991, less than 48 hours after the murders. The serial numbers matched. That gun had been with him for years after the murders, used in subsequent crimes, and ultimately turned on himself. There will be no trial. There will be no guilty verdict entered against him in a courtroom. No judge will sentence him. No jury will hear the full account of what he did to those four girls and return with a finding of guilt. The legal system has no mechanism left to reach him. For the families who had waited 34 years, the announcement delivered a name and a confirmed identity. It closed the factual question that had been open since December 1991. But it did not deliver the kind of resolution that a prosecution and conviction would have provided. There is no proceeding to attend. There are no final words from the perpetrator in a sentencing hearing. There is no moment in which the legal system formally assigns responsibility and imposes a consequence. The Austin Police Department identified the killer. The killer is dead. The case also leaves an accounting that cannot be undone. 2 men went to prison for these murders and lost years of their lives. Springsteen lived under a death sentence. The interrogations that produced the confessions used in those trials have never been fully reckoned with. The victims' families endured not only the loss of their daughters and sisters, but also years of believing the case was solved, then learning it was not, then waiting again. The community of Austin was told in 2001 that justice had been done, and it had not been. Brashers had died in January 1999 by suicide, using the same .380 pistol that a Border Patrol agent had found in a stolen truck 2 days after the murders, and he will never face trial for what he did to those 4 girls. For the families of the 4 girls, the September 2025 announcement brought answers, but not the kind that come with a verdict or a sentencing or any real sense of closure. Sarah Thomas was 13 years old when her sister Eliza was murdered in that yogurt shop. She has spoken about spending days afterward fantasizing that Eliza had somehow escaped, that she would come back. Eliza was her only sibling. Sonora grew up carrying that loss without ever knowing who was responsible or why it happened. The announcement gave her a name. It did not give her back her sister. Amy Ayers' brother Sean remembered her as a cowgirl who loved horses and cats and cared about other people. She was 13 years old at the shop that night only to get a ride home. Barbara Ayers Wilson lost both of her daughters, Jennifer and Sarah, in the same night. She told a reporter in 1992 that her life had been focused around them from here to eternity, and that someone had taken eternity away from her. That was true in 1992. It remained true in 2025. Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott were convicted of murders they did not commit. Between them, they spent nearly a decade in prison. Their confessions, which both men said were coerced, were the only evidence that ever connected them to the crime scene. No physical evidence, no DNA, nothing. Their convictions were overturned, their charges dropped, and they were released into lives that had been permanently altered by an investigation that targeted the wrong men. The evidence that ultimately solved the case had been collected on the night of the murders, in December 1991. Forensic technicians swabbed underneath Amy Ayers' fingernails at the crime scene and preserved what they found. That material sat in storage through every failed investigation, every wrongful arrest, every dropped charge, for more than 30 years. The technology to extract a usable DNA profile from it and match it to a known offender simply did not exist yet. When it finally did, the answer had been there the whole time. If this content proved helpful, please show your appreciation with a thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel so you never